We often point to the CB750 as Honda's first foray into the more advanced, big sport bike market at the end of the 60s, but actually there's another bike, arguably more radical and potentially world-changing, that came out years before the CB750, a motorcycle from Honda that almost nobody talks about. The insane double overhead cam CB450. As the 1960s got underway, it didn't matter if Honda or MV Agusta won every single class of Grand Prix racing. The biggest, fastest, and most desirable production bikes in the world were mostly British twins. Twin-carb Triumphs and BSA 650s ruled the streets. They looked good, they sounded good, they made a lot of power and a lot of torque, and most importantly, they were really light and nimble. Something that Harley never quite figured out. But by the time Honda started exporting motorcycles to the West in 1959, they were already the biggest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, selling some 500,000 motorcycles worldwide. But these motorcycles weren't exactly sport bikes. And even in their original advertising in the US, they weren't really branding themselves as a company capable of making a fast motorcycle. And so when the news broke that Honda was coming out with a new model, a high-powered 450cc twin with rumored race specs and a name straight out of Edward Turner's nightmares, the Black Bomber, well, Bonneville riders across the world were quaking in their engineer boots. But the thing that had made Honda Honda and had already brought them so much success was also a bit of a problem. In ruthlessly pursuing the sort of every man or woman motorcycle with a diverse but economical and rather unintimidating model range, they'd lost the more hardcore motorcycle enthusiasts who were still riding Harleys and big British twins. But Honda wanted to dominate every segment of the market. And as great as they were at selling little motorcycles, they simply didn't have a model that could compete with the biggest, fastest sport and touring models available. And despite dominating the mid to small classes of Grand Prix racing, nobody thought that they could make a competitive big bike. It was obvious that pulling from lessons learned in racing would really be the path forward for Honda. And if they were going to make a 450cc twin that would be competitive with motorcycles almost twice its size, it would need to rev. Thankfully, Honda knew how to make small displacement engines rev. They'd been battling more naturally powered two-strokes, and in terms of Grand Prix racing, they were arguably at their peak, having taken either first or second in almost every class but the 500 in 63 and 64. But the key to the success of their high-revving race twins and fours was something no manufacturer had brought to a mass-produced motorcycle: a double overhead cam engine. Now, the CB450 would be the most advanced production four-stroke engine of its time by far, and would remain so for years. All alloy, double overhead cam, a high-revving twin of only 450 cc's, but capable of over 100 miles per hour. The key to this engine's performance was its ability to rev way past what the big British twins or Harley's V-twins were capable of. And that would really be the only path towards making this bike competitive with those big bikes in terms of performance. It wasn't just that those motorcycles had dated overhead valve engine setups compared to this motorcycle. The CB450's valves also didn't use traditional coil springs, but rather torsion springs, which was very much derived from racing at this point and pretty rare. Valves are traditionally suspended by a coil spring, think something like a slinky, though hopefully, a bit more tension than that. Whereas a torsion spring is more like a clothespin. Torsion valve springs offered quite a few benefits for Honda in their pursuit of revs. They're not only lighter, but they also produce less friction at high speeds. Paired to a 4-speed gearbox, though down the road it would have a 5-speed, this CB450 Black Bomber was incredibly powerful and could power past 143 horsepower at 8,500 RPM, which is just ridiculous for this time. And in terms of specs, it was right on par with the British 650s. Now, on the road, though, it would prove to be not near as fast, and it also didn't make near as much torque. One contemporary owner of the CB450, a man who owned loads of sport bikes, said this about the CB450. The acceleration was at least as good as the 1000 Vincent I used to own, and possibly better once you got to high revs, which is pretty high praise, especially for a motorcycle of half the capacity. It had classic Honda amenities, including electric start, something Triumph's twins wouldn't get until a decade later, and it was even ahead of the Sportster in this regard. And the whole package just screamed racing, and Honda racing in particular, from the aggressive, strong, kind of meaty looking engine to the way the exhaust sweeped out and down. This really was the first time that Honda had lent into their racing program for a production motorcycle. And the result was by far the most technologically advanced and sophisticated performance motorcycle in the world. But more advanced doesn't always mean better in practice. Sure, it had an engine right out of the future, with a 4-bearing crank and pretty otherworldly specs. Mechanically speaking, it wasn't perfect though, and Honda would go through quite a few growing pains with this model. The carburation was off on this first generation, the gearbox ratios were not even close to ideal, but in most respects, the bike was still a bit of an engineering marvel for its class. One of the differentiating features of this twin versus the competition was its firing order. British vertical twins had a 360-degree firing order, which, as Fortnite says in his recent video, it's basically two pistons moving together, taking turns firing, which was, the best option for the level of carburation that was available through the 30s and 40s and 50s. And this 360-degree firing order is what gives those old British twins that distinctive and iconic, just kind of rumbly, roary sound. Honda continued on in their own tradition with a 180-degree firing order, again better for revving, and so the CB450, though it does rev and roar, it just didn't sound or feel as mean as a big British twin. Specs are specs though, and they don't always equal a bestseller. And this brings us to the real problem with the Black Bomber, the styling. Enthusiasts are petty, double overhead cam, cool. A 9,500 RPM redline, whatever. Does it look cool? That's all that matters. And Honda at this point hadn't figured out how to make beautiful motorcycles. And as cool as it was that the bike was called the Black Bomber and that it only came in this black and chrome paint scheme, which I love, the bike itself was just a bit off when you compared it to your other options. And in many ways, it also started with the tank. This bulky, some would say kind of top-heavy looking tank just didn't fit with the bike overall. Custom tanks could be purchased, which just matched the overall flow of the bike more and honestly kind of mimicked the British bikes a bit more in terms of the overall lines, and many opted for those sleeker tanks. The CB450 just wasn't distinguished enough from Honda's family of small displacement bikes. It just didn't stand out the way that the CB750 would. It is pretty cool looking back, especially in cafe racer form, but the CB450 wouldn't really come into its own in terms of style until the second generation. Honda first unveiled the Black Bomber in the UK at the Diamond Jubilee Brighton Speed Trials in late 1965. There the bike showed off its performance and that it was capable of 100 miles per hour, and the planned price for the bike would be the same as a Triumph or BSA 650, but the thing was, many didn't think it was as good as those motorcycles. And it turns out that Sportster and Bonneville owners could have a nice big sigh of relief. The Black Bomber wasn't quite on their level, and for now the British motorcycle industry could carry on without Honda completely obliterating them. Very few riders ditched their motorcycles in exchange for a CB450. Regardless of its futuristic engine, it wasn't a massive hit for Honda. And Honda would respond to the failure of the Black Bomber in 1967 with a revised version. Perhaps most importantly, this new model really looked the part. And here's what Cycle World had to say at the time of this second generation's release, and also about the new Scrambler CL model, which is also an awesome bike. They say, visually, pleasure in the CB and CL starts with the exceedingly fine finish, application of the paint is flawless, chromium plating is deep with reflective luster, welds and machine parts bear the mark of careful craftsmanship. These Honda hallmarks can only please and satisfy the owner. The visual appeal of the CB model is that it offers everything a present-day roadster requires: a touring-style fuel tank, twin low-sweeping silencers that function as well as carry a title, and a saddle that looks as comfortable as it is. This new CB450 was not only a better looking version and one that would really predict where Honda was going in the 70s with their style, but it was truly a better motorcycle in every way. Compression was raised, giving it even more power, and paired to a new 5-speed gearbox, power was really linear, the fueling issues were resolved, and on paper, and for many in practice, the CB450, with all of its kinks worked out, was really now the best sport bike that money could buy. In 1966, Robin Miller of MCN rode the Black Bomber around the Isle of Man TT for 12 laps and concluded, "Never have I ridden a machine with such fantastic acceleration. I am quite convinced that no British machine, whether 500 or 650, will touch it." The FIM decided to ban the CB450 from their Brands Hatch 500-mile race for being too advanced. Now that's the spirit of racing, the same spirit behind flat track racing here in America. I mean, it was pretty obvious why. The Black Bomber was simply faster than the big British twins at this point, and still nobody bought it. And so a scorned Soichiro Honda, which is always a dangerous one, went back to the drawing board and charged his team to take what they'd learned from the CB450 and go all in on a new, high-revving 4-stroke motorcycle. This same year, Honda announced its departure from Grand Prix racing with the goal of using all of their available resources to develop what would be the greatest motorcycle of all time, the CB750. The differences we see in the CB750 versus the CB450 are really those lessons learned from this failed motorcycle. First, styling matters. For being a radically new kind of motorcycle, the CB450 was not really an all-new design. It just kind of looked like the Super Hawk or really any of the other twins that Honda had made up to this point, and so it was associated with those non-performance machines, whereas the CB750 was truly an all-new motorcycle, top to bottom, with a beautiful, cohesive, and honestly, just more powerful and commanding design. Second, I think that Honda learned that more isn't always better for a production motorcycle. And this is really the difference between making a great sport bike for the track and making a great sport bike for the road. And so instead of continuing on with this Grand Prix style double overhead cam engine that, just revved to the moon, Honda went back to a lower revving single overhead cam setup for the new inline 4 engine. Sadly, the Black Bomber would go down as one of those motorcycles that were maybe too far ahead of their time. As we know, some 10 years after the release of the Black Bomber, all the Japanese manufacturers would start moving towards double overhead cam engines. One thing that I think Honda has always understood is that research and development doesn't always lead directly to sales. Sometimes you invest a lot into a model and it pays off right away, and certainly Honda had a lot of motorcycles that were that way. But other times, as a company, you have to take a few steps forward, more than you initially thought, and maybe even a few steps back to get to where you want to be. And so the CB450 would prove to be little more than a stepping stone for Honda on their path to complete motorcycle domination, but it's a really important one that I think we often overlook. This motorcycle should have put the other manufacturers on their back foot. The British manufacturers should have been scared at this point. They should have snuck into Honda's factories to figure out what they were doing, although I think they actually did do that at one point. But instead, they just kind of kept trudging along with their dated overhead valve engines, and in the end, Harley would be the only one to survive for now. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let us know in the comments if you ever owned or rode a CB450, or if maybe you were on to the Honda thing before everybody else. Ride safe.